Hey, bio class. This is our next unit. We've wrapped up cell division, and we're going to start a unit on genetics and hopefully try to squeeze in a little bit of protein synthesis as well. So this first slide just shows Gregor Mendel, who is considered to be the father of genetics, and he was a monk that he used pea plants to research heredity. That's going to be, if you're taking notes, and I encourage you to do so, the first term that you're going to want to copy down is the term heredity, passing characteristics from parents to babies. So that can mean in the animal kingdom, it can mean in the microbe kingdom, or it can mean in the plant kingdom. So the 7 traits, and you're going to want to copy down that term trait. The 7 traits that Gregor Mendel focused on are right there for you in pea plants. Everything from whether the flowers were at the end of the limb, which was called terminal flowers, not at the end of the limb, that's axial flowers. Were the pods yellow? Were the pods green? And he knew things about those traits that we're going to talk about. Next term that you're going to want to copy down is the term dominant and recessive. I encourage you from time to time to pause this if it seems like I'm going fast. The reason I'm going fast is because I know you can pause this. So the term dominant and recessive. So when you see traits that are expressed and seen, you know those traits to be dominant. If they're prevalent throughout the population, they're a dominant trait. If every now and then they pop up, but for the most part, they're hidden, they're considered to be a recessive trait. Gregor Mendel studied genetics before we knew about cells. He studied genetics before we knew about chromosomes. He studied genetics before we knew about genetics. And he came up with a couple of different terms before we even knew about these things. But one of his terms is the law of segregation. And that term means that alleles, and we'll discuss what an allele is in a bit, it's a kind of gene, a variant of a gene. In other words, you might have an allele for blue eyes, you might have an allele for brown eyes. That's just an easy, or curly hair or straight hair. That's an easy way to look at it. Alleles are segregated or separated during meiosis, specifically during metaphase 1. And the other law he has is the law of independent assortment. Alleles are separated randomly. This is exemplified by something that we studied last unit called crossing over, which makes things random. Okay, a couple of terms that you'll want to copy down. One being dominant, the other being recessive. You'll also copy down parent generation, F1 generation, and F2 generation. Those are important. Okay, so as we know, crossing over shows what happens during metaphase 1 in meiosis. And if you go back, that's responsible for the law of independent assortment. Something I think I'll put on a test that only people that are paying attention to this might catch. Okay, so what is a gene and what is an allele? A gene is a length of DNA on a chromosome that controls a specific trait. Okay, now many traits are controlled by multiple genes, and so I mentioned eye color earlier. That's a great example. You can't look at one place in the human genome and say, well, that's why his eyes are brown, or that's why her eyes are blue. There's many places that attribute to that eye color, but gene is just one particular length of DNA that codes for something. An allele is one of the alternative forms of the gene. So let's look back at hair color, curly versus straight. So there might be that straight hair is something that's dominant in a population, and curly hair might be recessive in a population. Okay? So if you have a curly-haired parent and a straight-haired parent, you're going to be pretty confident that most of the offspring will have straight hair. Okay, so if you're going to ask some test questions coming up, who is the father of genetics? What do we call a length of DNA that controls a trait? What are two forms of the gene called? And what is expressed, the dominant or recessive allele? So that those are the kind of things that you'd see on a test. Okay, so a couple of other terms you'll want to copy down. One is genotype and the other being phenotype. Okay, genotype, the genetic makeup of an individual or a type of gene. So, for example, in your genotype, you may have a recessive trait, but it's not necessarily going to be expressed. If your mom had curly hair and your dad had straight hair, you might have straight hair, but you have the genetics. Half of your chromosomes came from your mom, and so you have the genetics to possibly produce a curly-haired baby, but it's not expressed in you. So that's going to be your genotype. Phenotype, you just look at what you can see. So, yep, you have straight hair, so that your phenotype is that you have straight hair. Okay. In the cases here, tall and short, this top one, where if you can see where my mouse is, this top one, both the parents were tall, and this is referring to pea plants. So both parents were tall pea plants. In this case, both parents, one parent was tall, one was short. Notice how I used the lowercase to express short. I don't use the letter S because that might code for a different gene. And then two little s's mean both parents were short. And so that's going to be expressed also in the phenotype. So genotype, the genetics of you. Phenotype, what is seen. Okay. So let's look at plants for a second. So if they were fertilized by pollen, these acorns have the genotype to become an oak tree, right? So acorns that have been fertilized are going to become an oak tree. Now, is that going to be a tall oak tree, a short oak tree? Is it going to grow fast or slow? Is it going to be able to tolerate a drought? That depends on the phenotype. All those things that I mentioned are going to be expressed in its phenotype. Okay? Genotype is what genes it has. We don't really know those, but phenotype is what we can see. All right, the suffix here is zygous. Now you're gonna want to copy this down. So homozygous is, for example, that tall T, homozygous. Both alleles are the same. So big T, or little t, they are both homozygous for a trait. Homo meaning same, and zygous. Now, heterozygous means that one mom had one, say the curly haired, and dad had the straight hair. So that's going to be heterozygous. If their parents had different traits, they're going to be heterozygous for that trait. Okay, this bunny is homozygous recessive. If you look at it, you can see that it's albino, which means that if it breeds with anything that's not an albino, in all likelihood, none of its offspring will be albino. Okay, it's a very, very recessive trait. Now, it's homozygous recessive, which means it's all the way 100% recessive. So if it has a brown bunny or a black bunny, it's not going to have that trait at all. Okay. So, checkpoint. Test questions. What do we call a person's genetic makeup? That is its genotype. You can't really see its genotype all the time, but that's going to be its genotype. What do we call the collection of traits that are expressed? We call that the phenotype. Now, I say that these are the things that you can see, but also these are traits, characteristics that you might not be able to see. Like, for example, is it a plant that's drought tolerant? Or is it a plant that's not drought tolerant? Is it a personality trait? Is it quick to anger? Or is it calm? Does it have a good sense of humor? So these things might be expressed in the phenotype as well, but you might not be able to see them. Okay. What would big A be? That would be homozygous dominant. Big A, little a, that would be heterozygous. Okay, so homozygous recessive is what we would call the genotype. White fur, pink eyes, no melanin, that's going to be how we would describe the phenotype. Okay, when we're studying genetics, we use something called a monohybrid cross, and you're going to see this a lot in notes. You see it an awful lot in notes. Okay. We use a Punnett square when it's just 2 traits, monohybrid cross. We're going to use a dihybrid cross when it's more than 2 traits.